I hope that this is the first of many visits that Karma will make to Hampshire, and it's an honor to introduce Karma Nabulsi.
Okay. To the left of me is a postcard that I have kept on my desk wherever I have been over the last 15 years or so. I place it inside the notebook that I write in when I travel. In my study, I prop it up on a sort of wooden stand or against some books. It captures the perfect, if seemingly paradoxical tension that exists whenever I'm reading, or especially when I'm writing. The stairs in this picture lead up to a small room where an ambitious attempt was made to recover collective voice through solitude, with great struggle, endless complaints, protests, anguish, and much unpleasantness. Yet out of that isolation emerged a collective sensibility that captures, like nothing else I have read before or since, the numinous range of liberties and virtues so precious to so many of us in the world. It captures it for those still caught up in the basic grinding struggle for freedom, for those who have believed they have achieved theirs, but suddenly find themselves needing to protect them. That voice appeals, above all, to those who see their own liberty intrinsically tied up in the ability of others to possess it too, those who believe in a common humanity. And it is not just anyone's voice. It is the unrivaled, eternally stylish, irreplaceable voice of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or rather, the voice I wish to evoke this afternoon, that of citizen Rousseau. The picture of the house Rousseau moved to in the 1750s in the hills north of Paris, or to be more accurate, that he fled to, in order to escape the salon of that glamorous city. It was in this house Rousseau wrote The Social Contract, as well as his novel Émile. After they were published, a decade after his move to Montmorency, and within weeks of each other, he became a wanted man in both France and his own city of Geneva, where the authorities of both places publicly burned both those books and sought his imprisonment. He began a life on the run. What he wrote in that house, the drafts of his extraordinary political epic on war and peace, many fragments of which found their way into the social contract itself, somehow crystallized and formally instituted this collective voice, so immediately recognizable and intimately familiar, and at the same time unique, that of the general will. This is the notion I wish us to discuss this afternoon, and that of a general will of a people and collective voice, and how those are so closely bound to our own individual actions. It is these concepts that also connect us to the thoughts and writings of that great citizen of the world whom we are here to pay tribute to tonight, Eqbal Ahmad. Rousseau found it, on all accounts, extremely difficult to write. He would sit at his little desk for hours, engulfed in his struggle to locate that voice. He rehearsed sentences over and over again in his head sleeplessly at night. And it was by that slow, agonizing manner that he constructed the book, paragraph by careful paragraph. He later wrote about that time, saying that he had then come to see that everything is radically dependent upon politics. Rousseau wrote in many voices in each of the works he created, but it is this particular voice, a voice which I would like to argue today is within each of us, the voice so painstakingly retrieved in that gentle, quiet, small house, and then brought forth with a truly revolutionary force, the voice of the general will. It was indeed a citizen's voice, after all. This radical conception of freedom, of liberation, which of all the philosophes Rousseau represents, one that creates the moi commun, the common me, that is his lasting genius. That unmistakable voice, commanding, arresting, totally present. It speaks to the political predicaments of our day and touches our current desire, absolute desire, for both individual and collective freedom together. It is all here in the work of Citizen Rousseau, written in that house. Now, an important reason Rousseau wrote as Citizen Rousseau, and you'll see how I'm going to get to Palestine, bear with me, was because this work was engaged in the utterly absorbing, tangible, contingent reality of Republican politics, Republican with a small r, an engaged participant in the city-state of Geneva, and thus was immensely partisan. He was involved with a movement of groups, associations, and civic leaders, coordinating with other citizens of that city, all engaged in the huge battle with Geneva's oligarchy for political freedom. His work was a collective political act. Du contrat social is remarkably lucid and unambiguous. It is not a system of oppression or coercion, but instead the seminal text on emancipatory popular sovereignty, participatory and democratic self-determination, the very goals we seek in the practice of our freedoms. It is, of course, the philosophical foundations for the revolutions that lit up the horizon from the mid-18th to 20th centuries, including in this country, in the battle to establish representative republics against empire and monarchy, republics where people are sovereign, self-governing, and free. This political system does not exclude, but indeed relies upon an interplay between individual, public, and moral freedoms. For Rousseau, personal freedom was, without question, the most precious of these many freedoms we possess. This afternoon, I would like to reinstate what I believe is most useful, most inspiring legacy for our contemporary civic life and our activism on Palestine. For with Rousseau, as for Eqbal, the question was not, what is the just thing to do? Rather, it is the question before us now, how will men and women be moved to do the just thing? Here is also our question, how to understand people, to touch them, how to move the hearts, the passions, the reason and intelligence of individuals, and unite these in a living structure that can create a force large enough to overturn injustice. The answer Rousseau gave was to put him on a direct collision course with established authority. To my mind, it remains the most important philosophical and political question we have. The question is how to ignite an engagement that can truly assist those fighting for their freedom and who are facing oppression, to campaign, to organize, to be in solidarity in that true sense of the word, to live as a free people. This question was answered by Rousseau in the Republican spirit with which the social contract was written. Mobilization for progressive change happens in one way only, by practicing the virtues, individually, of course, but most of all, collectively. Yet the torches that light the fire of mobilization, he argues, are the simple things that make us all human: compassion, pity, and affection for humanity, which brings along with them a hatred of cruelty, unfairness, injustice. And if you possess those human qualities, then you are gifted with the universal in Palestine, inasmuch as you can see it as an issue of equality, of freedom, justice, of human rights, and against colonialism, military occupation, and racism. If you possess those qualities, if you possess those capacities, and it brings you to the Palestinian cause, then I'm almost going to say, God help you. But what I wish to say is this: you will find that common love of humanity, and you will need it, but you will almost certainly need the more robust array of Republican virtues: I don't speak for myself here. As a Palestinian, one is presented quite early on with two rather crude options: surrender or resist. But for those citizens, movements, ordinary and extraordinary peoples the world over who have thrown in their lot with us, have stood and struggled with us for so many generations since the second half of the 20th century, it is a much more complex and delicate matter. I could hardly hope to pay tribute to their strength, their courage, their tenacity, all the virtues of a free citizens. For it is often an arduous and tricky endeavor to bring the universal to this particular location. I am not speaking here of Rachel Corrie, who was just mentioned, that shining young American girl killed while trying to protect a Palestinian's home from being razed by the IDF in Gaza, or that radiant young British activist and student Tom Herndl, shot and killed by an IDF sniper in Gaza while trying to help schoolchildren get home. It is the everyday heroics of it, absurd and crushing. The academics who ring me in Oxford or in Europe, or, of course, from America, anxious to discuss the ugly pressures they come under from their colleagues to be silent as soon as they begin to work on Palestinian rights. It is the tastelessness, the tawdriness of it. When musicians are told they will never work in their industry again if they hold a charity concert for Palestinians, these particular ones ignored it. Or the idiocy of the BBC bureaucrats who refused to run a charity appeal by the Emergency Disasters Committee for Gaza during Operation Cast Lead. It is the boring relentlessness of it for those who have fought against apartheid and for a free Palestine as a single, united cause, and have still not given up on us after decades, no matter how distant, how fantastical, how unattainable it eventually begins to feel. I refer to human rights NGOs who battle in their boardrooms to be able to put up a letter appealing to international law on their website, to British parliamentarians who battle in their select committees with their colleagues to apply equal standards, to US congresswomen hounded out of office for affirming the simple fact, as if it was an act of lunacy, that Palestinians have human rights too. National news editors, news anchors, besieged by a torrent of abuse arranged by professionally organized special interests. The point is, however, that this phenomena operates almost entirely upon the fear of losing power. And so, miraculously, the reverse is also true. Once you decide to ignore it, nothing can really touch you, unless, of course, you are a member of Congress, or teaching in an American university that is sadly not Hampshire College, or a Palestinian suffering the sharp end of the Israeli war machine. Not everyone understands that this is how it works, so they lose their nerve before they can begin. But what is true is that no one is immune from the ugliness of this pressure, either perceived or real, or misunderstand what it means, or how one is to respond to it. It forces one to choose, sometimes quite unpleasantly and dramatically. What cost one's principles here, today? Intellectuals and activists who call for nonviolent action in line with international law, in peaceful protests of Israel's ongoing war crimes against Palestinian citizens, that is, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, are themselves vulnerable to the ugliest of attacks on their motives, to threats of legal action, to unscrupulous bullying of the most breathtaking order, and not just in America. And I think students here have had some experience of campaigning on this issue. And so, I raise here something that many of you already know. It is on Palestine that the universality of human rights reaches its utmost test for anyone that chooses to enter the public arena to fight for them. and those who do not end up testing the limits of their own humanity. It is a fascinating thing. The closer you touch established power, the more ephemeral and distant Palestine becomes, until, approaching the very heart, Palestine turns ghost-like, practically invisible, haunting in its present absence. Under these perennially harsh moral conditions, the moi commun, the common me, needs to overcome a voice that, often with some justification, is arguing for a greater caution, a prudent silence. No good whatsoever can come of this. The liberal model of individuals possessing only interests versus a different model of the collective spirit. If you have the former as your guide, it makes you afraid for yourself, of yourself. But if you have the latter, there is actually nothing more fun, more freeing, and more encouraging than to work for justice in Palestine. Because you discover it does not hold you back, but it takes you forward. The act of raising the moi commun on Palestine is the same act that creates citizens, a moral freedom of an absolutely modern kind. Over the last decade, in everything that I write about Palestine, I find I need to describe in as much detail as I think people can bear the course and breadth of the geographic, social, political, and existential fragmentation Palestinians have been enduring by military force since 1948, and in an especially acute and accelerated manner over this past decade. Today's Palestinians are more violently fragmented than ever, trapped in prison, under military occupation, scattered in refugee camps across the Arab world, with no legal status, or rather, possessing the peculiar status of an already extinct people. When we discuss this terrible state of affairs amongst ourselves, it's in terms of witnessing and struggling against a new catastrophe. There is a common understanding that what we now live through geographically, economically, politically, socially, in every sense of our civic connection to each other, is worse than, more annihilating than, but as destructive as the 1948 catastrophe. The cataclysmic result of that dispossession of the majority of our people from their land and the violent destruction of our society means that the right of return to one's home, enshrined in international law, and for Palestinians in yearly United Nations resolutions since 1949, is more than an aspiration. It is understood not only in international law, in human rights law, but by every Palestinian, refugee and non-refugee, as both an individual and a collective act, and one that accrues to any refugee anywhere. A basic view on the right of return of an individual Palestinian hardly matters. That we as a people, a refugee people, are unwilling to abandon our humanity in this way, under constant violent pressure and siege, means only one thing: one serves the common me, the moi commun. Yet it seems this essential right, just this one, is one right too many, too far, for those who wish to help us, and that there is a limit for many of them to what we as Palestinians can imagine it is to be human. So to those who say that the refugees are an obstacle to peace, I maintain that they are instead the key to it. To those who claim allowing Palestinians to choose whether they wish to return to their own homes, villages, farms, and cities is an aggressive and destructive act against Israel, I would say reconciliation between our peoples must be the goal of anyone serious about peace, not to say human rights, and who are not themselves racist or wish to possess the spoils of ethnic cleansing. To those who argue that the victims of the conflict, namely the Palestinian refugees, are actually the villains by holding on to their rights, by holding on to them, and that until they surrender their basic rights, no peace can come, what Eqbal called the peace of the weak, then I would have to conclude that they possess no serious commitment to the notion of universal human rights, and that they prefer to maintain a state of war between our people, and to join in the exertion of pressures on the Palestinians to surrender. To those who say that a deal is only possible if you exclude the victims of the conflict, the majority of an entire people, from a peace process, I would simply point out that the only way peace has ever been achieved is by making peace with the actual people concerned. Peace is achieved through inclusion, participation, respect, dignity. How did we get to such a situation in 2010 when to argue for basic human rights according to the UN Charter, its principles, human rights declarations, Security Council resolutions, and the international legal principles that guide and underpin human rights the world over is seen as the obstacle to a solution for the Palestinian people? Advocating for Palestinian refugee rights is characterized in this matter as a direct result of the last decade and a half of international peacemaking called the Oslo process, where the issue of the Palestinian refugees, the very core of the conflict, was dropped entirely from the language of official peacemaking. This essential issue for Palestinians is understood only in apocalyptic and existential terms, signifying to the average Israeli the destruction of Israel. The Oslo framework for resolving the refugee problem was presented as the only pragmatic, realistic solution. And this unspoken understanding of a final settlement would comprehensively ignore refugee rights. It focused on developing mechanisms that would impose this settlement through a system combining compensation, absorption of existing refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza into local neighborhoods, of the refugees into host and third-party countries, and the resettlement of some into the West Bank. This was to be done by mutual arrangement between Arab host nations and the international community. They were to present this to the refugee population inside and outside of the West Bank as a legitimate, and Gaza, as a legitimate agreement negotiated by the Palestinian Authority, acting in the name of the Palestine Liberation Organization, whose presence and signature would guarantee its legitimacy. This approach has absolutely no chance of succeeding for many reasons. Let us begin and remain, and now finish, upon the most central. Beyond the fact that it's against human rights law and international conventions, which of course ought to concern us, another reason is it will not work is quite plainly not a single Palestinian constituency accepts it in any form. It is entirely unrepresentative of the Palestinian body politic, refugees and non-refugees, and this is easy enough to establish. Accordingly, people will continue to respond to these attempts to deprive them of their inalienable rights by the only means left to them. They will protest, rise, resist, articulate their reality, identity, essential quality as human beings, and the demand to be treated with respect. If we decide that it is finally time to abandon frameworks based upon conquest, colonialism, and ethnic cleansing, the policies that have created this impasse, then a new path opens before us. If we are sincere in our desire for peace between our peoples, we are obligated, we are responsible to address this experienced daily tragedy of the Palestinian refugees with imagination, with creativity, with compassion, and above all, with a common humanity that admits only the universality of human rights. Until we do that, the general will, the collective voice that resides within each Palestinian, commanding, arresting, totally present, binds them in a common struggle which is universal. And the Markoma will continually bring generation after generation of freedom-loving individuals and groups across the world who sustain and strengthen their principles through participating in our struggle. We welcomed Eqbal, we welcome you, and we welcome Amira, who has been with us for such a long time. I'm not sure she's even happy to be welcomed to our struggle anymore. And with that, I'll close and introduce Amira House. Thank you.